Welcome back to the Happy Horse Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr. Nerida and I am a specialist equine nutritionist, and one of my biggest challenges as an equine nutritionist is that so much of equine nutrition relies on forage. It makes up and should make up a majority of every horse's diet, which means understanding what's in the forage for a horse is a really important part of being a horse nutritionist, and it's also a really important part of being a horse owner and feeding a horse as well. So today we are joined by Anthony and Kimberly from Feed Central and Local Ag to talk all things hay and pasture testing. So welcome, Kimberly and Anthony.
Thanks, Nerida.
Thanks, Nerida. Thanks for having us.
Great to have you with us. So the tiny little backstory to this episode was I was speaking with Anthony about various hays the other day for a client, and Anthony said to me, "Oh man, I'd love to pick your brain for hours." And I said, "Well, let's do that, but let's make it a podcast." So it's a little bit of I guess it's a Q&A session today. Normally I have guests on and I ask them questions, but today we have guests on and you're asking me questions, and we'll also talk about the services that Feed Central offer in terms of hay and pasture analysis, and the fact that we can also buy tested hay from Local Ag. So just as a quick little intro, Anthony, how did you get involved in forage, I guess, and it's all livestock that you deal with, but how did you get involved in the business, and do you have a background in horses?
Yeah, Nerida. So I started with Feed Central just short of 4 years ago now. Completely different from what I was doing before that. Or I was in sales. So I've come here as a salesperson, working more in the sales side of the hay and meeting with clients and building the business that way. But the equine side of things for me, I somehow just picked up an interest in racehorses. And since that, it's gone from owning shares in horses to breeding horses, hanging out with trainers, just loving the whole industry itself. And it's sort of developed from there. And my daughter rides horses just casually on weekends now. So it's become a real interest of mine. And I've probably just sort of found myself picking up little bits in these areas where people start talking equine or whatever. My ears sort of go, hang on, what are they talking about? And I end up chatting with those and meeting with those. So anything that comes through the business now, equine, I have a little bit to do with that. People like yourself, nutritionists and stores and that, just love talking about the industry and for finding out more for myself, and just finding out challenges for people that are like me as well, getting into the interest of equine. That's correct, yeah.
And I'm glad it's thoroughbred racehorses. Yeah, so that's a really good thing, because we'll talk a lot about how much, particularly pasture analysis, is important in the breeding of thoroughbreds, because man, it can have a big impact on whether you get a horse that is sound or not.
Yeah, that's right.
Cool.
Yeah.
How about you, Kimberly? How did you get involved? Because you're very much on the lab and analytical side.
Yeah, so I'm on the lab testing side. I think I grew up a bit rurally and surrounded by animals. So unfortunately, while I loved horses, my parents were always firmly against owning horses because of their feed. So I did grow up around cattle and other poultry and other animals and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, I just had to content myself with my friends' horses and that sort of thing. But I delved into the testing side because I'm quite interested in the nutrition and how that impacts really all animals. So I'm not as specialized on the equine side. Yeah, just fascinated about nutrition, went to uni, did a bit, some of the nutrition courses and animal production courses there, and slotted into a lab and learnt the testing side. Following. So I've been with Feed Central now about 6 years, or probably going on 7 now, on the feed testing side.
Awesome. Isn't it an interesting thing? I had the same experience. I got to uni and I'd never thought about being a nutritionist as such. And then we started doing the biochemistry and the nutrition modules. I'm like, man, I love this. I love it. And you're right. I mean, it impacts all animals. Definitely. It is what our bodies are built from. It's what runs every single metabolic process. It's such an important part of life. But and knowing, I won't say often, I occasionally threaten to go and be a pig or poultry nutritionist because they don't have to deal with forage. So they can, they've got all this fancy gear that can tell them exactly what the protein is running at in the wheat that's running through the
Like that.
instantly, and they don't have, when you're dealing with grazing animals, especially in our climate, we can go from having lush green sort of early to late vegetative pasture through to like completely browned off in the space of a couple of weeks. So I guess for me, the forage analysis part of horse nutrition allows us to know, for horses that 80, 90, close to 100% of their diet is that forage, it allows us to know what they're actually eating. So it's such an important part of managing horses and managing their nutrition. The problem is when people get a pasture analysis, it's a page full of numbers.
At a specific time point too, isn't it? Like that.
Yeah.
It changes throughout the day, and as you said, in a matter of weeks, it can change.
Exactly, yeah. But yeah, so for hay, not so much. Like it'll stay pretty, apart from vitamins, which we don't test so much. But yeah, pasture, exactly. And I would say to thoroughbred farms, like I've walked, I don't know, it's thousands of pastures doing pasture analysis, and literally by the time you get that analysis back, the pasture will be different to some extent, but not. That doesn't negate the need for testing.
Yeah, so you like using that as sort of your base numbers and guideline. You still get a good indication of the quality of the pasture, even though the results are a week later from when you perhaps collected the sample.
Yeah. Yes, and I find too when you for one farm, when you build up a suite of analyses, I guess, over many different seasons and many different years, you start to know what the pastures are going to be doing. But anyway, I'll stop talking, and I'll let you ask some of the questions that you had in your head, Anthony, and any that you want to throw in too as well, Kimberly.
Yeah, thanks, Nerida. So yeah, like you said, we were having a chat the other day just about something in general, and just the way you started talking about things and facts and numbers and that. And I really just sort of wanted to delve into some of those questions, I guess, that we have, and questions that we get from our clients as well. So yeah, we'll pass those on and see how many we can get through. So let's start with the importance of a feed test on hay, whether that's produced or purchased.
Just explain to me what you mean.
So just when people are, whether they're producing the product themselves or bringing something in, that they get that test done sort of straight away, so that they've got those numbers right off the bat, I guess, for feeding.
Yeah. See, for producers with hay testing, I mean, I think it should be illegal to sell hay without an analysis. That's how strongly I feel about it. Like if you, like, it's really hard to buy an item without actually knowing what you're buying, and it may be more from a is there anything harmful in the hay? Is my first consideration, and then to know, how much protein am I getting, how much energy am I getting, what is the mineral balance like. So certainly for producers, like if you're a hay producer, definitely get your hay tested. I think there's some wonderful hay producers in my region that send off every batch to get tested, and so you know what you're buying, and you know whether the hay is suitable for this horse or that horse, and whether it's completely unsuitable and in fact dangerous for some horses. If you, as a producer, if you're testing your whole batch of hay, it saves then for horse owners. If a horse owner buys 50 bales and then they need to get that tested, it shortcuts all of that messing around. You've got your hay, there's the analysis, and people can buy that with confidence. For people buying hay, always my recommendation is, if you can, buy it based on an analysis. So buy hay that's already tested. And you guys are a great example through your local ag. Like you've got it's like a supermarket of tested hay. And the thing that I like about your system is that it's actually your team that tests the hay. It's not the producers themselves. So we know as consumers, and this is what I like about it as a horse owner, we know as consumers that that test has been done legitimately on that batch of hay. Because I have seen in the past where you get very dodgy looking analyses that look like maybe they aren't the one for the hay that they're telling you it is. So yeah, to buy on, and I had a really good example just a couple of weeks ago. Massive batch of hay that was bought for racehorses and tested after the fact, and it was high in nitrate. Then what do you do? you've already bought the stuff. So buying hay on an analysis, so purchasing hay that's already got an analysis saves you from buying something that you then find out later is actually not suitable, and you have to do all of this readjusting or sell the hay again if you can for use in another animal species or as garden mulch, as has been the case. I've seen that happen many times over the years too, where hay for horses has been so high in nitrate that literally the only thing you could use it for was garden mulch.
So just a little bit on our process with that. You touched on it there that our guys are outgoing doing that testing as well. So we have a group of inspectors and also what we call roving inspectors. So they're going out and doing those visual inspections and taking samples across the lot and sending up to our lab here in Toowoomba, and that's where all our results are generated from. So
Yep. And I think the cool thing about your lab is that you use the Dairy One or Equine Forage Labs calibrations for your forage analysis, and they're a brilliant lab. And for many years, like, I could almost in my sleep fill out all of the customs forms that you need. It was quite a complicated process to send it over to the States, but we didn't have the option back then of doing their analysis here. So it's very cool that we can use their.
But it is still an option, these days. Unfortunately, we've actually been getting an increase in queries on people for the equine testing side of things coming through our lab, because recently, with all the introduced tariffs and the extra paperwork and the interruptions to the postal side, it's actually become more of a headache than it was 5 years ago. And processes would streamline, and they're not
Yep.
there at the moment. So we can facilitate that testing as well, if required, if it's not able to be performed here. But it is still an option for Australian producers
Send over to there.
Outsource
Yeah.
to Nerida, because they are a very premier equine testing facility, and why we're partnered with them.
Yeah, no, they're brilliant. I love the equine analytical crew. Rightio. Next question.
okay, I talked about the importance of hay just then. So what about the importance of a feed test on pasture?
So pasture's an interesting one. We've already sort of covered this in that, by the time you get your pasture analysis back, because plants never sit still. They're on their way to somewhere. So, and their entire purpose in life is to reproduce, set seed, drop that seed or have it eaten and carried around or whatever, and then die. So there's that progression, from they germinate and then they go through their vegetative stage where they're building up enough leaf material so that they can make the energy to reproduce, and then they'll reproduce. And depending on the climate, it's interesting watching. I'm always watching plants and pastures, but it's interesting watching them. If it's cooler and wetter, then they'll stay in their leafy stage a lot longer. But as soon as they think that maybe it's going to dry off, it's like they panic and send up their seeds. And at that point, as soon as they send up their seed heads, energy and protein start like diving quite dramatically and dropping. So you're never going to hold in your hand a piece of paper that tells you exactly what is in your pasture. But the thing for me with pasture analysis is the mineral side of things. So that to me is much more interesting than the energy and protein, because you can see. So most of my pasture analysis work over the years has been done on broodmare farms, herd breeding farms. And the reason we're so interested in pasture analysis on those farms is because the calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, potassium levels change dramatically as a plant matures. And if you don't get particularly the calcium phosphorus ratio balanced in the diet, and I know I'm probably telling you things you guys know, but if you don't get the calcium phosphorus ratio balanced in a diet, then you have massive problems with developmental diseases in the foals, including things like OCD. And I've seen the dramatic cases of pastures that have got a very unbalanced calcium phosphorus ratio, and the diet being fed is not balancing that back up. And the farms will have 50% or more of their foals with OCD. So massive implications for the sake of a relatively cheap pasture test compared to a $5,000 surgery, a very cheap pasture test. So for me over the years, testing pasture has been much more about looking at the mineral content, and it is mostly, I mean, the trace minerals are really interesting, but you can almost say with certainty in 90% plus of the pastures anywhere in the world, we're going to be too low in copper and zinc. Manganese is all over the place. Usually in Australia it's really high, but on some of the farms I work with in Japan it's really, really low. So I actually deal with manganese deficiency up there, which is not something I deal with anywhere else in the world. And then, in the States, different states will have very high selenium levels. Some will have very low selenium levels. In Australia, we're pretty much all low selenium, and also in Japan, all low selenium. So we have to be really conscious of that. But it's mostly looking at those macro minerals and seeing that it's particularly in improved pastures that have been heavily fertilised, and particularly heavily fertilised with phosphorus and potassium, because we're not using soil tests to figure out what fertiliser should go on the pastures. These farms are just dumping fertiliser on. But what we've seen over and over and over again in pastures is that calcium will be really low and phosphorus really high when they're leafy and green. And then as they mature, that starts to swap. So calcium will become higher than phosphorus. But in those early stages of growth, I've seen calcium to phosphorus ratios as low as exactly 0.2 to 1 was the lowest one I ever saw. Like you're going to get, like that's like wheat bran in your pasture. So maybe not quite as extreme, but close enough. And you would definitely get if horses ate that consistently without proper calcium supplementation, they'll get severe calcium deficiency. And that's why we see foals that are, and particularly weanlings. So, we tend to wean coming into, well, we don't tend to, we wean coming into an autumn, and we'll get a flush of pasture growth again. So be it here, in the southern hemisphere, northern hemisphere, it's all the same thing. You wean into a flush of pasture. And so you've got these weanlings who are now completely dependent on their pasture hay and whatever feed they're getting. They're no longer getting their mother's milk. And we've got these unbalanced calcium phosphorus ratios in the pasture. It's a disaster. So, and if the farms don't know that, then they're not managing for it. So it's really, really important that you know what's in your pasture.
Just while you've mentioned that, and with the two that we've just spoken about, pasture and hay, what's the chances of owners saving money on other feeds, I guess, if they know what's in the hay and pasture first, like you touched on minerals? So there might be minerals in the pasture that means that they can eliminate some other feeds. So what are the chances there of owners actually saving money knowing those numbers?
I guess horses are a little bit different in that we manage them for an optimum body condition as opposed to, and also optimum growth rates as opposed to production animals where we're trying to get them to grow as quickly as possible. So I think the savings are not so much in the feed, because horse farm managers and horse owners tend to be reasonably good at knowing, when they need to add supplementary feed and when they don't need to add supplementary feed. And in fact, when we test, say, stud pastures, breeding farm pastures, usually what I have to say to the farms is you need to feed loosen hay with your pasture, because if we're just relying on pasture as the forage, I can't balance up your calcium phosphorus ratios unless we use some loosen hay. And sometimes that's a really hard thing to get past for them because they've got so much pasture, and then I'm telling them to also feed hay. So there's not so much cost saving there. Where the cost saving comes is that when they take those horses to sale, or say it's like a warm blood breeding farm, when you get that horse through to being a 9-10-year-old and just sort of starting to hit its straps as a dressage horse, it's not going to break down on you in the joints because it had a good foundation to start with. With your race horses, if you get them through to a yearling sale and they've got clean x-rays, they're going to be worth a lot more than horses that don't have clean x-rays. They won't have had a surgery that costs thousands of dollars and then lots of rehab time in stables, which is very labour intensive. So I think in the horses and in production animals, definitely a different story. But I think in horses it's more that we keep them really healthy and either prevent the loss of value of that animal, or we prevent the very expensive veterinary intervention to fix the problems that the pasture might have caused when they were young.
So when you're testing pasture, you've already mentioned there that like, you're really keen to look at the mineral ratio. Like that's a key point you look at. Do you have anything else that's really high on the list on what you really need to be considered when looking at a test?
Yep, I do. So the thing that is highest on my list and has been for a long time is nitrate level. It's such an important one to know because it is toxic for horses, and it has a lot of it'll do a lot of damage in the gut. It will cause abortions in mares. So if you're a broodmare farm again, or breeding any horses, you don't have to be a broodmare farm. You might have one mare in foal, and you're on pasture that has the capacity to accumulate high nitrate, or you're feeding hay that's high nitrate. So it's one that I always want to be testing. And just for context, the plants take up nitrogen from the soil as nitrate. So it's a natural thing. Every plant does it, but there's certain climate conditions, so cloudy days and windy days will increase nitrate levels. So, if hay is cut on a cloudy and windy day and it's in a soil that's rich in nitrogen, then the potential for it to be high in nitrate is much higher. Or very early in the morning is when nitrates are going to be high. So if I'm interested in nitrate, which I always am, I like to test early in the morning to see if we can catch, because pasture will change. Whereas hay, like whatever it's baled with, it stays, I would imagine, over a long period of time at that level. I don't know that nitrate has the ability to go anywhere, does it?
No, not in hay, no.
Stays in there. So where the plants, when they're still as pasture and obviously still alive, they'll use that nitrate to assimilate into protein and create protein out of it. So it fluctuates. That's really high on my list. Pastures, what else do I like to look at? If it's a laminitic horse or pony or something that's got metabolic conditions like Cushing's disease, which is now called PPID, really we need to know what the water-soluble carbohydrate and starch levels are so that we can add those two things together and figure out the total non-structural carbohydrate. And that will then tell us, is that pasture safe to graze, is that hay safe to eat? Of course, the thing with pasture, and this is where I start to threaten to become a pig or poultry nutritionist, pasture doesn't sit still. So it, just over the space of a couple of hours, its water-soluble carbohydrate level and starch to some extent, depending on the species of the grass, it changes dramatically. So plants, I love plants. They're so clever. They make their own food. Like, how cool would that be if we could just go and sit out in the sun for a while and go, okay, I'm fed now. It's awesome. But except I'd miss my chocolate and my soft cheeses. But plants with their green chlorophyll and sunshine and water, and I know, again, I'm not telling you guys anything you don't know, but the plants sit there and photosynthesize, which we all learnt in high school science. And during that process of photosynthesis, they create their own food as carbohydrate, and then they later eat that food to fuel growth and reproduction and all those things. So over the course of a day, when they've got light, they produce carbohydrate, and then when it's dark at night, they will eat that carbohydrate and grow. The next complicating factor that comes in is if it's very cold overnight, they don't spend much time eating. They kind of just shut down and try to stay alive when they're frozen, or very close to zero, which means that they can make carbohydrate during the day, but they don't use much of it at night. And if they're a temperate grass, they have no limitations on where they're allowed to put their water-soluble carbohydrates and a little bit of starch. So it's almost like when you fly and you've got very strict luggage parameters, you're only allowed to take 7 kilos of carry-on and 20 kilos. It's like if you're a temperate grass species, it's like the airline goes, you just bring as many bags as you like. You can put them wherever you like in the plane, and you've got no restrictions. And that's what they do with their carbohydrate. They just stick a little bit here and a little bit there. And, I've tested, and it's funny, isn't it funny, the parts of your life that just stick in your head? And I vividly remember one afternoon we're walking through an oak pasture doing a pasture analysis. It was freezing, like proper freezing. My hands were hurting because it was so cold. It's probably why I remember it, because I was in pain. And we were testing, like just collecting the leaves of this oak pasture. It was 33 or 35% non-structural carbohydrate because of the climate conditions that it was growing in. Like it was cold, but it was sunny. And so it was photosynthesizing, but not really growing very much. And it just had accumulated. So that would just blow the feet off a laminitic pony or horse.
Is that safe to feed to any horse, Nerida?
No, it's interestingly no. So thoroughbreds, very insulin sensitive horses. So your laminitic horses, 90. The last estimate I heard, which was from Melody Delat, who's a professor at, I've forgotten which uni. Sorry, Melody, but one of the Queensland unis and brilliant in this area. But I saw her. She presented at a conference I was at back in May this year, and she said, 90% or more of laminitis cases are due to insulin dysregulation. So when a horse or pony eats something that has got a lot of starch or a lot of water-soluble carbohydrate, they'll get a rise in blood glucose, and then that blood glucose will trigger a disproportionate rise in insulin. And it's the insulin that actually does the damage to the feet. So for, say, a thoroughbred, they're really insulin sensitive. So they can eat that and get a normal rise in blood glucose and a normal rise in insulin, and it doesn't trigger laminitis in them because they don't have insulin dysregulation, versus a horse like a couple of mine who are very metabolic, and they tend to get cresty, they get overweight very easily. If they ate pastures like that, then they would get that massive rise in insulin, and then that would trigger their laminitis. The interesting thing is that we've had a thoroughbred here, a lay, and we literally just filmed the last video in the Queensland Off the Track nutrition series for off the track racehorses. And the last one that we are doing is the story of a lay in her first 12 months off the track. So we took a lay in as an off the track. She's this gorgeous, big thoroughbred mare. And I took a fecal sample from her on day 1. And then at 1 month, at just around 5.5 months, and then 11 months. And we've done a really detailed microbiome analysis at each time point, detailed to the point of we know every single species that was in her gut at that time of bacteria. And the cool thing that we saw, cool, not cool, and it's always what I've suspected happened, but we've never actually had the evidence to show it, is that she started off around 250, I should go and get the actual data, but she started off around 250 bacterial species in her gut on day 1. A normal reference range is 350. We got her up to 333 at the 5.5 month point. So just with feeding lots of forage and lots of different types of forage, we were able to build her bacterial diversity back up. But then when we did the test in October, which is the middle of spring for us in the Southern Hemisphere, I could smell the manure sample was acidic. And I'm kicking myself now. I said to Belinda, I can't believe I didn't do a pH on it. But she said, don't worry, we've still got it in the freezer. We'll do a pH on it sometime when we pull it out. And I said, okay, that'll be cool. But I could smell that it smelt acidic. And I thought, you know what? I reckon all the ryegrass that she's eating at the moment, and it was that sunny days but very cold overnight temperatures. And that had dropped her bacterial species back down to 300. Hang on a second. I'm going to go and find the actual data. Wait there.
Get it.
It's right here. Ta-da-ta-da. So it is, so she peaked at 333 at 5.5 months. And then in that spring, she so she peaked at 333. And in the October, in the spring sample, lots and lots of ryegrass, and it dropped back down to 319. So I think that, no, it wouldn't cause laminitis in them, but it's still not ideal because a lot of that water-soluble carbohydrate is fructan, which is not a sugar, but it's a carbohydrate that can't be digested in the small intestine, but it's highly fermentable in the hindgut. So it's like starch that is indigestible, and it does the same thing. It favours the starch fermenting microbes, and they build up their numbers, and then they start to kill off the better fiber fermenters, and you lose that diversity. And I've never seen it. I mean, we've been talking about it for a long time, but I've never actually seen it happen. And when I saw that, I went, it makes perfect sense that she's gone up but then dropped back down again.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I love that you had to go and find those figures too. brilliant.
It's super cool as I know that people listening to this can't see that, but that's the actual species. So you can see like over here, there's the dominant, there's some dominant bacteria and they decrease over time and it becomes much more even over time. There's not those bacterial species. But anyway, we'll do Dr. Belinda, the microbiologist, and I'll do a whole podcast on that. But it is super cool seeing what's going on in their gut with the changes in forage over time. Yeah.
So with the lemonitis, you did touch on it there very quickly. We also have a local branch here where we sell our product to locals. They might only have 1, 2, 3 horses. And it's certainly, we see it coming through that they're recommended to us because we feed test our hay, like you touched on. Horses have lemonitis, so they do require the low sugar hay. With those guys, when they look at a test, what should they be looking at and where should those levels be at?
If we're just talking about from preventing triggering their lemonitis and just talking about the carbohydrates, they should be looking at the starch plus water-soluble carbohydrate, which makes up non-structural carbohydrate. Lots of terminology in this space. So it's, water-soluble carbohydrate, we abbreviate to WSC. Non-structural carbohydrate, we abbreviate to NSC. So that non-structural carbohydrate level is the number that I use personally. So there is other people who use different numbers, but I just don't think we have enough evidence to wander off and go and use like starch plus. ESC is another one, but I think it's risky. It's risky doing that, and I think in doing that we miss the impact on the hindgut as well. So I stick with NSC, and it just keeps it easy for everyone who's got one number to look at, and for very sensitive horses, so for horses that are particularly horses that are currently in a state of laminitis, so they're sore. And the owner's trying to manage them, that number should be less than 10%, ideally. I use on an as-fed basis. So if the hay itself sitting there as it is less than 10%, then that, I find that's low enough. Interestingly, though, there was at the same conference that I mentioned before in May, there was a presentation that was Professor Pat Harris from the UK, and they had done a study, and I think they had a hay that was 9% NSC, and there was still one horse on that was not okay. I'm thinking, oh dear me, no, that's pretty extreme, but yeah, if you've got a laminitic pony or horse, then less than 10%. If you've got something, so say my horses, 2 of my horses had laminitis. Gosh, it must be 10 years ago, and it was in summer. We'd sprayed our pastures, and stupidly, I'll never ever do it again. I don't spray pastures now, but we'd sprayed our pastures, and I'd left them on it. So part of me wonders whether that actually had a massive impact on their microbiome, and that triggered their laminitis. But I also did pasture analyses, and I took a pasture sample at 6 o'clock in the morning, or it might have even been earlier. It was at sunrise and sunset in January, so it was like reasonably early and quite late. And over the course of the day, the pastures went from, like, I forget the exact numbers, but it was something like 8%. It was definitely less than 10 first thing in the morning, so it was something like 8%, and it was bumping 20% at the end of the day for non-structural carbohydrate. So for horses, and they are both metabolic type horses, so that also could have been well and truly enough to tip them into laminitis. But for those guys, I mean, they haven't had laminitis for many years now, but I'm still really conscious of what I feed them. So for them, I would feel comfortable going out to 12% non-structural carbohydrate in hay, and particularly if it was hay that, they had pasture and they were also getting some hay, if it wasn't the only thing they were being fed. But yeah, if something's laminitic or has only just been laminitic, less than 10% is where you want to be heading.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a word you were mentioning there, and speaking to a few equine nutritionists and that, one thing I've picked up is you use this word more than anyone else, and it's starch.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. That's possibly because my whole PhD was about starch. So starch is where I feel like I am like truly a specialist, I guess, in starch and starch digestion and all the impacts that starch will have in a horse's gut. But from a forage perspective, starch, it honestly doesn't play much of a role. Like plants make starch, like leafy plants. We're not talking about cereal crops and things like that, because they obviously make a lot of starch and put it all into their seeds. But pastures and most hays, you normally won't see a lot of starch. The one exception to that is teff hay. So I have seen teff hay, and again, like, I don't know how many thousands of forage analyses I've looked at over the years, and I can't remember the exact number, but I do remember seeing a teff hay that had a surprisingly high level of starch, and its overall non-structural carbohydrate level was well out of the realms of being safe for a laminitic horse. So you do have to be a little bit careful with teff. And again, this is why it's so important to feed tested hay. Because you know, a lot of people buy teff hay for laminitic horses thinking that teff is
Safe, isn't it?
safe.
Yeah.
But it's sometimes not. And yeah, it's sometimes not. And it doesn't take much. So I bumped into a friend here in Tamworth the other day. I hadn't seen her for a long time. And she'd borrowed a pony from us, and you know, her kids ride. And I was asking how all the I probably should ask people how their kids are, but I usually ask them how their horses are. And I was asking her how her horses were, and she mentioned that Lightning, their gorgeous little pony that all their kids have learnt to ride, is not doing well. She's been like super sore, laminitic, and she said, I just can't get her right. And she's on teff hay. And I said to her, you do need to be a little bit careful with teff, because some of it won't be low enough in non-structural carbohydrate to be safe. She said that's really interesting, because she'd not long bought a different batch of teff, so she probably had used up the one that she had, and then she'd bought another batch. They were both untested, unfortunately, so I don't know what the numbers were, but she said she's definitely better on the new batch. And I said, well, probably because it's lower, either lower in non-structural carbohydrate. Nitrate can also trigger laminitis. So this is why I always want to know nitrate. And the reason I've been so acutely aware of nitrate for so long is because I worked with Janadria Farm in Saudi Arabia, which was the king's farm for a long time. But the reason I got involved with them initially was because they were having all these issues with laminitis in their young racehorses, so young thoroughbred racehorses, who typically you shouldn't see laminitis in these horses. And Frank, the brilliant vet that managed that farm, had already figured out that nitrate was high in their hay, and perhaps that was what was going on. And then he found me somehow, and I started working with them. And we just started a really strict hay testing protocol of, if anything was above 500 parts per million of nitrate, we ditched it. We would not feed that. And all of the laminitis issues went away. That was the only thing we changed. And they also had all these funky placental issues in their brood mares, and just stuff wasn't right in a lot of horses. And when we started to pay a lot more attention to the nitrate in the hay, because their hay grown in Saudi Arabia is like hydroponic hay. It's grown in the desert on massive pivot irrigators. And if you mistime the nitrogen application or mistime your time that you harvest, then you get these really high nitrate levels. So there was lots of high nitrate hay there. But yeah, it stopped the laminitis. So I don't know how I ended up talking about nitrate again when you asked me about starch, but
No, right.
It's linked, and that's interesting.
hey, just dropping in for a tiny moment. If feeding your horse feels messy or confusing, there is an easier way. The My Happy Horse app takes you from guessing to confident in minutes, so you know exactly what your horse needs every day. Think of it as your pocket-sized nutrition genie. Find it at myhappy.horse or on the App Store. All right, back to the show.
The next question is actually safe levels of nitrates and what to consider when feeding. I know, listening back in some of your other podcasts and even talking to you the other day, you talked about, it all depends on how much the forage might of their diet. So just some of those factors to consider, I guess, and the safe levels.
Yeah. Yep. So you're right. It does depend how reliant the horse is on the hay, but my gold standard is less than 500 parts per million of nitrate. And I will just mention, you presented on your analysis as nitrate nitrogen. So nitrate nitrogen times 4.43 is nitrate. So if you're looking at nitrate nitrogen, it's less than 100 and something. parts milligrams per kilogram or parts per million of nitrate nitrogen. That's my gold standard. If I could always choose, and if I could always find that's what I'd be going for. For race horses, I'd really love it below that all of the time, because they're on hay and they're reliant on, and yes, they get a lot of grain, and often racehorses get way too much grain. But for racehorses that are fed really well and they've got free access to hay, having it at that 500 parts per million of nitrate or less is where I want to see it. I will push it out to 1,000, because sometimes people can't find the low nitrate hay. So up to 1,000 is okay. If you had horses that were getting, like say for my horses, that through winter they'll typically get a flake of lucent hay over an evening, especially in the sort of the early winter with the very short days, they're only getting a flake of lucent hay. So 1,000 parts per million at that intake wouldn't worry me for them. I'd prefer to do my head in. Because I would prefer it to be lower, but it would also be okay if you had a laminitic pony is a really good example, and they're off pasture completely while they get through an acute phase of laminitis. For them, I definitely wanted it 1,000 parts per million or less as well, because that's all that they're eating, and we know that it damages the gut, and they don't need, when you do any damage to the gut and then the gut starts leaking, then you set up systemic inflammation, and the whole body is already in a state of inflammation when they've got laminitis. So again, like that, less than 500 parts per million is ideal. Where it starts to get dangerous, and particularly with broodmares, is at 3,000 parts per million you will start to get abortions. And I think it's like 9,000 parts per million is the deadly level for ruminants, and I don't know whether it's about the same, but like anything above 3,000, that's an immediate no for me. It's too dangerous to feed it to them. And something is interesting. I hadn't considered it, but the way that nitrate will actually cause death is that it turns hemoglobin, the stuff in our red blood cells that hangs onto oxygen and transports it around our body, it turns it into meth hemoglobin, and it's unable to carry oxygen. So when animals eat really high nitrate forages, it turns all of their hemoglobin into the meth hemoglobin, and then they suffocate essentially, because they can no longer transport oxygen around. If you're a race trainer, think about that. If you're converting even the tiniest percentage of hemoglobin into meth hemoglobin, you're limiting that horse's capacity to perform, because it can't carry oxygen as well as it would be otherwise. So forget toxic levels, forget leaky gut, forget all of that stuff. The impact potentially on performance could be the half a metre that is the difference between you winning a race and coming third or fourth. Mm. And yeah, owner satisfaction, all that stuff. Yeah, you understand this, Anthony. Imagine if you could get your horses an extra half a metre in front all the time.
And all the things tied with that, including prize money and
yeah. Like, I'd hate how many dollars we've lost on that, but we won't go into those losses. We'll talk about the wins instead. So the other day when we were speaking, Nerida, we started talking about different types of hay and some of your clients and some of the feed tests that have come through. Now, there was one that you described as almost the perfect horse hay. Let's pick that apart and put together why you made that comment, I guess, on that lot.
Yeah. So I know this hay. I haven't seen it. I'd love to. I have to go and see it. It's a local one to me. And the really unusual thing about it is it's Timothy, and we don't get Timothy hay in Australia. So I'm like, yay, someone's growing Timothy. So anyone in North America listening to this, you'd be going, you what? You don't get Timothy hay. I work with a lot of Timothy hay because it's the predominant hay that they feed in Japan. So I see it a lot. And I love it, but it's Timothy plus other grass species. So this particular hay producer has gone for producing hays that have got a variety of grass species in them, so that you're not just feeding one or two different types of hay. That, to me, is becoming probably my focus as the most important part of horse nutrition, because that's getting that species diversity in our hays, so your different grasses and legumes and things into your horse's diet, then creates the microbe diversity in the hindgut, and that's such a big part of what we need to do to keep them healthy. So just from the outset, I love this hay because it's got lots of species diversity in it. And then when you see the analysis, it's a interesting and I'm sure also a little bit frustrating analysis for the hay grower, but it is almost the perfect performance horse hay for a few reasons. So one thing with high level performance horses is we don't want to put too much protein into their diet, because when you put lots of protein into their diet, it makes them urinate a lot. And then when they urinate a lot, they lose a lot of electrolyte because they dump electrolyte in their urine, and then they'll start to get problems like arrhythmias and tying up and loss of appetite if they're sodium deficient, things like that. So I don't want for a high performance grass hay that's going to form the base of a horse's diet. I never want that hay above 12% crude protein, because it just makes them urinate too much. And this one's sitting just below that. It's at 11.7, but we'll give it that. And then like very high in energy. So again, if you're feeding high performance horses, like this hay would be a total disaster for laminitic horses. And it's an interesting point in that there is no perfect hay for horses, because it depends on what, like straw is a perfect hay for a laminitic horse or pony that just needs to be filled up. You would not put straw anywhere near a racehorse. I mean, yes, there's bedding and they will munch on it out of their bedding if they want something to chew sometimes, but, as part of their diet, you wouldn't even consider it. So it depends. Horses for courses. It depends. But this, this hay is sitting at 10.4 megajoules per kilogram of energy, and that it doesn't mean a whole lot without context, but say straw is around 6 and oats is around 12 and a half. So it's high. This is high for a forage at 10.4. The other thing I really like about it is its mineral balance is very, very good. So its calcium is in beautiful ratio to phosphorus, and you don't always see that with high quality hay. Sometimes you will get more phosphorus than calcium, and then you have to be very conscious of that and balance that up later in the diet. But this one's got a beautiful level of calcium, so 0.45%, and a really nice level of phosphorus as well, 0.34. And they're in that, I haven't actually calculated that ratio, but it'll be, if you've got a calculator there, work it out for me, but it'll be a really nice ratio. And then the other super cool thing about it for performance horses is when you get decent levels of potassium, that potassium will actually increase the pH of the horse's body, and it'll give you a higher lactic acid threshold. So it means that a horse can exercise in an anaerobic state, so absolutely flat out at the end of, we're talking a lot about racehorses for you, Anthony, in the sprint home in a race. If you've got a higher lactic acid threshold, it means they can create muscle energy from muscle glycogen without oxygen for longer. And so they can sprint for longer. And potassium is one of the major minerals that will increase that lactic acid threshold, because it buffers the horse's body and makes it more alkaline, so that there's more capacity for the horse's muscles to accumulate lactic acid before they'll shut that system down. So I always look at potassium. Disaster for dairy cows because it'll send them into milk fever and all of that sort of stuff. but brilliant for any horse that's training and competing at a really high level. So I love the potassium level. It's like at 2.6% or 26 grams per kilogram in this hay, and that's a really nice level of potassium to get. And then we could go through everything else is pretty normal. The one thing that I don't like about this hay, and this is where it is not the perfect hay, is its water-soluble carbohydrate level is really high. It's at 24.2. So for me, this hay makes a beautiful addition to a diet in a small quantity per day. So if I had a racing stable that, had a small number of horses and they were able to say, each horse gets 2 to 3 kilos of this hay per day, and then the rest of their hay is made up with a hay that has got a much lower water-soluble carbohydrate level, it just means that they won't negatively affect their microbiome, like we saw with a lay, like on that. And I'm kicking myself again, and I didn't measure the pH. And I also should have gone out and grabbed a pasture sample and sent it to you guys so that we could see what the water-soluble carbohydrate level of my pastures was at the time. But I guess that's all clear in hindsight, having seen what's happened to her hindgut. But I think this hay would do something like that. It would generate more acid production. It would just knock the microbes, the fibre fermenting microbes around a little bit. But as part of a ration, unbelievable.
So, Nerida, you were just talking about diversity in product and species. What's the relationship between diversity and consistency of feed? Like, do animals, like if you're currently on quite a monoculture, I suppose, of how to introduce that diversity safely? Are you going to shock the animal?
Yeah, you shouldn't. I mean, always best practice is introduce anything new over a period of 2 weeks. So if your horse was on a monoculture of something and then you wanted to introduce a different hay, then yes, introducing it slowly is a good idea. Forage is not so much of a risk of shocking them as such, because it's not so there's things like oil and starches that are digested in the small intestine, and you need the pancreas to sense that those nutrients are in the diet so that the pancreas will start to creating the enzymes or the little scissors that will cut those nutrients up. The forages, more of the digestion happens in the large intestine, and it's a matter of the microbes going, oh, this is available now, and different ones will build up their populations over time. So, but yeah, I mean, I always say to people just to be on the safe side, and particularly if you've got a horse that's got health challenges or is that it's a little bit sensitive. But the interesting thing is, we know that from lots of published studies and also my own observations on massive farms with hundreds and sometimes thousands of broodmares, when they don't have diversity in their diet, they're much more prone to colic. In bringing the diversity in, you should be reducing the risk of problems like colic that are generally, the things that we go, oh, where did that come from? Sort of, did I just shock the system? And things like weather events. Vets will often tell you, it was raining for the last 2 days and we had all of these horses in with colic. And it always makes me wonder, for horses that are out grazing normally and then it's raining. I mean, I do it with my horses. My horses will all come and be sad underneath their massive shelter shed because it's raining and they don't want to go out in the rain. So I'll feed them a lot more hay in that period of time so that I know that they're eating and they've got hay in their belly to keep them warm. But that, on top of a hindgut that doesn't have a diverse microbiome, has got the potential to push them into colic or other issues. So yeah, you do need to be careful if you're coming off a very limited diet and then to putting them on something different.
One thing that I see when people are looking for hay, cereal hay mainly for their horses, in Queensland, they tend to request your beardless barley hay, but the southern states are more oat and hay. What's the main difference between those two on a feed test?
I read this question and I was like, I don't, because it's interesting. Like I've always been either New South Wales or Victoria. I've not ever lived in Queensland. I've not ever fed I've fed lots of other people's horses up there, but I've not ever used the ornless barley. And I suspect, like most forages, the difference is going to be more from the stage of maturity that they were cut, the soil that they were grown in. So it's a little bit like lucerne and clover. I mean, they're different species, but if you handed me analyses that had the names crossed out and I didn't have any details and you gave me one of lucerne and one of clover, it would be nearly impossible for me to tell them apart. Maybe the starch.
Yeah. And you touch on something else right there, is that's another thing I'm noticing with the horse clients that are coming through me is the, I'm not going to say merge, but the option of clover as well as lucerne.
And I always used to say to people, back before we started to get this much better understanding of the importance of ingredient diversity from a microbiome perspective, that they were so similar, it wasn't really a point of having two in the diet. Now I say, if you can feed both lucerne or alfalfa, depending on what you call it, and clover, then it brings ingredient diversity into the diet, and that's good for a whole lot of reasons. So yeah, clover hay if you can get it, is beautiful. But I think, and you might have a better answer to this than me because you're seeing so many of the analyses of oat and barley. But I think the bigger difference is, I mean, they're so similar. They're both cereal. They're both grasses, so they are going to be very similar. And if some barley hay is cut off very heavily fertilized, high phosphorus soil versus oat cut off a much lower phosphorus soil, and the difference in different phosphorus, it's not because it's barley and oats, it's because of the way they were grown.
Because of that. Yeah.
Is that your observation as well?
Well, my observation looking at the feed test, and I can't get into the regional differences because by the time it ends up in the lab, I don't have that bias. I don't really look at where it's come from. But generally, as a rule, I tend to find barley as actually a higher sugar hay, like out of all of the cereals, as that general rule, which is where I found interesting that Anthony's had that experience, and maybe it's Queensland. It doesn't get to this extent, but as a rule, like barley can be a very high sugar, and cereals in general, but barley most of all tends to accumulate your sugars higher. The NSC is.
When is barley hay normally cut up around your region? What time of year? Or how early in spring is it baled?
So we do barley on our farms, and we would have cut that in November, end of September, early October.
Yeah, so that's possibly your answer. And then when are they're cutting? So a lot of the oat and hay down around South Australia, it's normally cut and baled a fair bit later, isn't it? Like around now.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
November time.
Yeah. So I reckon that's going to be your difference. I think it'll just be that because in late September, early October, the days are getting long enough to do a lot of photosynthesis, but the nights are still that bit cooler. So you're in that climate, those climate conditions that basically support the accumulation of water-soluble carbohydrate. And that's the same that hay that we just spoke about and went through in more detail, its analysis. It was cut around that time as well. And we had this spring in my area, we had lots of like runs of, we were still getting frosts overnight, but the days were really bright and sunny. So it was perfect sugar accumulating, and that was also when we did that fecal sample on a lay. Perfect water-soluble carbohydrate accumulation. So maybe if you grew, and I don't know whether it would grow down there, but if in theory, if you grew barley hay down in South Australia where they grow a lot of the oat and hay for the dairy industries, you may find a very different thing. But I know you did drop me a bale of ornless barley here for one of the Racing Queensland videos, and it was the most beautiful looking hay. And as soon as I could, I gave it to my partner Ryan for his goats because I wasn't game to feed it to the horses. Like it was just so, I mean, particularly my horses, and I've got laminatics here, so it's just not worth the risk. But yeah, it was really high. I think it was like 24-25% non-structural carbohydrate, something like that. We'll finish up soon, but have you got one more question that you?
There was only talking about ideal hay, which we can skip that. The only other thing I don't think I've asked is what test do you recommend, which you've sort of covered with the nitrates and whatever.
So can I just go back to the ideal hay? We've mentioned it already, but just to say it specifically, there is no ideal hay. Yes. And it very much depends. And it's probably something that I should do with you is create like a horse profile and that horse's ideal hay. But my advice more recently in the last few years, people say, what's the best hay? And my answer is as many different types of hay as you can find.
Yeah.
Because in feeding lots of different types of hay, and there's a podcast about ingredient variety and how important that is, and a big thing that I focus on in that is if you're feeding 3 or 4 different types of hay versus just one hay, if you have one hay and it's high in nitrate, that's all your horse is eating. Versus if you have 3 or 4 different hays and one of them is high in nitrate, it's not so much of an issue.
Yeah.
And the same with
dilutes,
Yeah, so you're diluting out any toxicities, you're diluting out non-structural carbohydrate. So if you've got, a laminitic horse or pony and you're feeding multiple different types of hay and hopefully you're feeding all tested hays. But if you happen to have one that's sitting at 12.5%, 13% non-structural carbohydrate, but it's in there to provide fiber variety and you're only feeding small amounts of it, then again, it gets diluted out and it makes it a lot safer. And then you get all your nutrient variety as well. There's lots of reasons. So for ideal hay, yes, there is ideal hays for different types of horses, but feeding lots of different types of hay as well also covers a lot more bases than if you're just feeding one type of hay.
Yep.
What was the other one you said?
Oh, just the tests that you recommend for your clients, which
Oh, yeah.
so a few times there about adding nitrate.
Yeah.
Minerals and sugars
Yeah.
are the sort of the big key items that you're looking at.
Yeah. I mean, I do love to see. I love data, so I do love to see the energy and the protein, especially for performance horses. I definitely want to know the protein. That's critical, and the energy also. I don't pay a lot of attention to the fiber fractions. Like as long as we've got enough energy without being too high in the water soluble carbohydrates, and the fiber fractions are not as important in equine nutrition, I don't think, as they are in dairy. Certainly, they're important in ruminant. More so, and then the minerals are really important, particularly if you're breeding. So, for you breeding thoroughbreds or any horses, it's so important to make sure that your overall diet has got balanced calcium phosphorus ratios. And this is where I haven't mentioned My Happy Horses the whole time, but this is where using nutrition software starts to be really crucial, because you have got your forage analysis. And like I said, it's just a whole bunch of numbers. I mean, I can look at them now and read them like kids' books because I've looked at so many over the years. But it's just a whole bunch of numbers unless you line those numbers up against what a horse actually needs. And if you've got a forage that's too low in calcium, too high in phosphorus, then you'll be able to see, what other ingredients do I need to bring in to balance up that calcium phosphorus ratio in the overall diet and prevent the problems that forage would otherwise cause if you didn't do that.
With your message of the importance of getting hay and pasture tested, the inclusion of your My Happy Horse app, there's certainly a lot more people now taking interest in feed tests, getting tests done. In the racing industry, you've got trainers now setting up sports science departments. How much are you thinking that's going to grow? Like, it's pretty exciting for people like myself, and I imagine you're the same, that love data. To sit there and listen to those guys and see what they're tracking and how much do you think we're going to see that influence the rest of the industries?
Oh, I hope a lot. And I say to race trainers, we spend so much time focused on their hard feed and their supplements and all the other stuff that, sometimes is not even necessary. The injections they give them, which is crazy to inject anything nutritional. It was never designed to be injected into them. It should go in through their mouths. But, they spend so much time and money on that part. And yet it can be hay that will bring them undone.
Yeah.
And they're not paying any attention to it whatsoever. It's just hay. So my hope is that over the next 5 years, you'll see a lot of trainers absolutely fanatical about what they are buying in their hay, because it will bring a racing stable undone if they get the wrong hay.
Yeah.
So, and I think in the leisure horse world, that push really needs to come from the industry, because when you're buying hay in small lots, it's not economically feasible to send hay for 10 or 15 bales off for analysis.
Yeah. Which is when you come back to, I think, your point at the very start is the importance of the grower getting it done.
Yes, and it should be illegal to sell hay without any analysis. Which I can say. You guys probably can't say that, but I have no vested interest in saying that. So. It should be that hay must be sold with an analysis. That's the way I see it. And I guess as horse owners, the way that we can to start to have that happen is to start asking for hay with an analysis. If you can't get one, move on and find a hay that does have an analysis and go on. I love browsing through local ag. It's like a supermarket to me, but you go, there is plenty of hay that is sold with an analysis at the moment. So I think that's only going to change when we as a horse industry and as horse owners start to demand that we have, or ask nicely that we I get a little bit passionate sometimes. But ask for hay to be analysed so that we can buy and support growers that do sell based on an analysis.
Yeah.
Well, that was great. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Thanks for being here. And do you want to just give us, Kimberly, just a quick rundown on if people do want to send a hay or a pasture in for analysis, just give us a rundown and where they can find more information, please.
So you can just jump onto the Feed Central website. So we've got some information on how to collect samples, because obviously grazing is probably the hardest thing to collect a sample for, because you're obviously wanting to test what they're eating. But we've got some handy tips on how to take a sample. So cutting at grazing height, try and be your horse. If they are avoiding weeds, don't include that in your sample. It's not something they're eating nutritionally. Same with hay samples. Like what we want is diversity in sample collection. You want to take it from multiple points. You want an average for the lot. You don't want this one section of the paddock that may have been, have a dip in nutrition because of its soil structure or that sort of thing. So all of that's outlined on the website. You can get a sample form. The office is always happy to receive calls in as well for how to take a sample or what tests might you be interested in. We do have nitrate testing, sugar testing, mineral testing. If you're interested in any of that, happy to have a chat.
Yeah, awesome. And I'll put the link to you in the show notes, and I'll also add a link there to Equi-Analytical, so anyone outside of Australia and particularly North America can go and check out there. I mean, you're one and the same in the types of analyses pretty much that you offer, but and I might also add in the show notes too, which analyses I would do in the most common situations, so that people know which ones they might like to choose.
Yeah. No.
Very good.
Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
And likewise, thank you. And we must do this again sometime if we come up with
These questions
another.
actually came more from me, so I hope your listeners get something out of it as well.
Very good. Thank you. All right, catch you later.
Nerida.
Cool. Thanks, Nerida.
If you'd like to know more about the My Happy Horse virtual equine nutritionist, you can head on over to myhappy.horse. And also, while you're there, check out the Dr. Nerida AI, which is me in AI format. And that version of me is happy to answer your questions about horse nutrition 24/7. Thanks again, and we'll catch you soon.